Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Pathways to Excellence. I have the distinct pleasure today to welcome Mr. Professor Geoffrey Williams to this channel right here. Professor Williams, it's an absolute pleasure. We are here, I believe, in your stomping grounds of the University of Malaya, and well, the rain had just let up right there. So thank you again, Professor Williams, for being on this channel.
It's not really my stomping ground.
All right.
I have to say, I had come here very rarely. I'm just here for the Malaysia Economics Association meeting. But it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Well,
Perhaps I will come more often now that you.
oh, wow. Wow, we managed to get someone to come to the University of Malaya. Yes, that's right. Amazing. We stem brain. I was going to say brain drain, but like that doesn't exactly apply here.
No, it's not a brain drain. It's inflow. It's an inflow to raise the level.
To raise the level.
Just for today.
Just for today. All right, cool. Wonderful. Well, Professor Williams is a distinguished professor of economics and essentially the founder and director of the Williams Business Consultancy. He is a graduate of the University of Cambridge, Girton College, essentially the alma mater of certain luminaries, of course, that we may know of, like the late Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of this country, or not to say founder, but certainly the father of independence, Tunku Abdul Rahman, and numerous other distinguished individuals who have come over the course of time right here. If I could ask them, well, Professor Williams, well, what brought you, well, to Malaysia?
I was working in Oxford,
Yes.
and as you know, in Oxford, we have very long summer holidays. And during the summer holidays, I was asked to come and teach here on a block module. And I came, I did the block module for the MBA and MSc program. And then after I went back to Oxford, they asked me to come permanently. So after that, I moved.
Wow, interesting. Huh. So was that a difficult decision for you in any way? Was there any part of you that had asked yourself, like, shall I move over to Malaysia? Or
I think not really, actually,
really? Okay.
in the sense that I spent 3 years at Pembroke in Oxford, and it was absolutely marvelous. There's no question about it.
Mhm.
But I had colleagues there who had been undergraduates, and they were already in their 60s and retired, and
Ah, I see.
so they had been there basically all of their life.
Mhm.
And although it's absolutely wonderful, one of the reasons that Oxford and Cambridge work so successfully as academic institutions is that nothing changes in terms of the schedule. Schedule is so clear and so set that that type of routine is something that it means you don't have to think about anything.
I see.
You know, this idea that this story about Einstein wore the same clothes every day, and they asked him, why are you wearing the same clothes? He said, so I don't have to think about all of that. It's sort of that. It's like, why does something start in October, and then we have a break, and then it starts, and then we have the
Wow.
exams. And so in a sense, that's marvelous.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you sort of know what's going to happen.
Wow.
And so when I came here, it was very, very different. And I thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's quite exciting.
Wow.
And also, I've done Oxford. I've done Cambridge, I've done the University of London at the London Business School.
Okay. So is it kind of like what else is there to look forward to in life?
Yes, but it was also that coming here, and certainly working in the private universities is very different to working in the public universities in the UK.
Mhm.
And the second thing is that all of the universities were new, completely new. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge are 8 or 900 years old, right? So
Oh yeah.
you're coming and you're working in a completely new environment where you're building something or hope to be able to contribute to building something.
Mhm.
And I thought that was just something that I definitely wouldn't be able to get that in England.
Mm.
So I thought, well, it's interesting to do that, and why not?
Fascinating. Wow. So like it was kind of a monumental break from routine in some ways. From well, the Einsteinian routine, the Mark Zuckerberg routine. He was wearing the same shirt every single day for a while. The Steve Jobs routine right there, kind of like freeing the mind from all those things. Well, thank you for that. How would you describe that, that like transition to Malaysia?
All right. People ask me this a lot, actually. And they always say, did you think, was there a culture shock coming to Malaysia because it's multicultural and all of this? The answer to that is no. It wasn't at all from that perspective. Because the United Kingdom is extremely multicultural. And actually, many of my students were from Malaysia. And even when I was at Cambridge, some of my peers are from Malaysia, from Asia, generally speaking. So the difference in culture was not so big a shock to me. The difference between working in private university, franchise university, and working in Oxford or working in Cambridge as a student or working at the London Business School, that was a huge shock. That was an incredible shock. Because the standards and the level of professionalism, the way that people behave, the level of courtesy that they have for each other, the respect for the students was terrible, absolutely shocking. Very, very, very poor. And I found that to be really very difficult to transition to. The change in I'm coming from a university environment, world-class university environment, to coming to another university that was claiming to have these world-class credentials, and finding that it was really quite shocking, actually, very, very poor. Particularly, I felt the way that they were treating students in particular.
I see. Okay.
And I felt a particular concern about that because the students are paying. In England at the time, the students had only just started paying because I left in 2000, so the student fees were only introduced in 1997.
Interesting.
So most of the students weren't paying because they were finishing and graduating.
Well, and even now, the tuition fees for, shall we say, British nationals are quite reasonable. I mean, like you can imagine that maybe a standard issue student in, Cambridge's economics department might pay maybe something like 9,000 quid. For
£9,000, yeah.
9,000 pounds, yeah.
But you know how much I paid? Nothing. Euro. I paid nothing. And in fact, they paid me because I got every term. We had 3 terms a year. I got every term a grant. And they covered my accommodation, my food, and a little bit of the expense.
Wonderful.
So I paid nothing at all. And I'm wholly opposed to the introduction of tuition fees. This was the Labour Party in 1997.
Right before the Asian financial crisis.
Yeah, but there was no announcement of this in their manifesto in the election. And suddenly, completely out of the blue, they introduced tuition fees, £3,000. Now they're up to £9,500. Well, so in a 3-year course, you're about £30,000. And as an economist, it's very clear to me as an economist, it simply is not worth it. And certainly here in Malaysia now, it's absolutely not worth it. If you want to pay a 30,000 ringgit course fee to go to a private university to do a standard course in management or accounting or something to that, the return on investment is so poor that it makes absolutely no sense for people to do that. And I think what's happening is we're seeing it. The stories of people leaving school and not going to university, and they prefer to take a gig economy job first and all of it. We're seeing that. You don't need to be an economist in order to understand.
Absolutely.
That, you're going to have 3 or 4 years with no income. You're going to pay 30,000 ringgit for your degree program with a debt from PTA. And then after that, when you finish, you're going to start a job on average graduate salary of only a little bit over 1,600 ringgit, barely above the minimum wage. And you don't need to be an economist 30 years in order to understand that just doesn't make any financial sense. And what we're seeing is that many students coming from school are putting off that decision. And we're seeing the student numbers falling. And I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. I would genuinely encourage people to think hard before they go straight into university out of school.
Fascinating.
I didn't do that. I took a year out, and I was unemployed actually for the idea. It's not that I did something wonderful and worked for a charity or anything like that. I didn't. I was unemployed in Liverpool, which is where I'm from.
Yeah.
And I didn't really do anything at all during that time. But nonetheless, going then to Cambridge to read economics, I was probably the only one of my peers who could actually say, I have experienced unemployment because I've just spent 12 months. I've just spent 12 months being unemployed. Right?
Wow. Okay.
And as a consequence of that, it gives you a much. So, what is your experience? My experience is that I was unemployed, right? And then how can you interpret that when you're studying economics?
I have a question then. The economic definition of unemployment, in many cases, references the idea that a person is seeking a job willfully, but then is unable to find a job.
Yeah.
Did that apply to you, or was it more of like, well, I had essentially just been through this whole academic experience, but then essentially I just did not work for.
I was looking for a job.
You were looking for a job?
Yes.
Wow.
But there weren't any. It's as simple as that. So, but yet I was looking for a job. My job search was not particularly aggressive, I have to say. Sort of randomly looking through the classified ads at the back of the newspaper in the morning, and then saying there's no jobs, Dad, and it's like, well, yeah, perhaps you should go out and look for it.
Well, then that.
But I was formally looking for a job. Well, formally, yeah.
And that allows us to then transition to why I even asked Professor Williams to appear on this podcast in the first place, to talk about the costs, the benefits of higher education. And we've had a very rousing introduction to that. But at the same time, Prof, well, even as we speak really about, well, the higher education that essentially students in Malaysia are experiencing right here. So you've said quite a fair bit about, well, the extent to which it is essentially worth it. And what I'm hearing here is that you seem to be converging upon the maybe it is not really worth it in this particular context. But if we then consider, the place that we're in right now, we're in the University of Malaya Economics Faculty, so then that's a public university. It may not be exactly like Cambridge, but essentially it's one of those institutions that is, well, nationally funded. It's meant to be affordable. People can essentially, well, study here and learn a variety of things then. When you think, Professor, about, well, public universities, do you feel then that maybe, well, it might actually be worth it to study here?
Okay, from a purely financial perspective, it probably is. Because although you have to pay certain fees and you have to pay hostels and all of this.
Yes.
Nonetheless, it is very much less expensive than a private option.
I see.
And so from that perspective, in terms of the return on investment, it probably is better to go to a public university.
I see. Okay.
Because you will be able to, whatever is the cost over the 3 or 4 year program, you should be able to recover that relatively quickly after graduation.
I see. Okay. Interesting.
But I also think that it's very important not to view universities as training centers, skills centers, uplifted skill centers. The purpose of going to a university is actually to go through this process of self-actualization, if you like. It's about pursuing something that you are interested in, not for the purpose of getting a job.
Wow.
And if you go to university for that purpose, of course, I would always encourage anybody to go to university for that. That's why I suggest people should take a year off first and ask themselves the question, do I really want to do this 4-year IT course? Or actually, am I just more interested in doing a Microsoft certificate so I can make apps or do content? Right? They should really think about that and not be pushed by their parents or their teachers or their peers. Because I think that far too many students are coming to university with this idea that it's going to get them a better job. And the truth of it is, it won't. And that's just based on the data. This is not a question of cynicism or anything like that. the data is very clear. There are nearly 2 million people in Malaysia who are underemployed. That means they have a job that is below the level of their qualification. And almost all of those are graduates, university graduates. And if you take the people who are underemployed, the people who are unemployed, and the people who are outside of the labor market amongst the graduate community, it's almost half of all graduates. So if you ask yourself the question, I go to university, am I going to get a graduate level job or a graduate level income? You might as well toss a coin, because 50-50 you won't. And part of that is that people have gone to university with the idea that this is a pathway to a higher salary, a pathway to a career, that it's a training center, that they're going to learn skills. And that's not what we do at university. What we do at university is to provide an education. It's a rounded experience. And it's an experience where quite a lot of the time, you will be expected to teach yourself.
Absolutely.
Because you will be pursuing your own interests. Right? I mean, clearly, according to the curriculum, guided and helped by your professors. But nonetheless, you will be the one who goes to the library, picks up a book, right? And or you go online and you do it online, right? And that means that you have to have that interest in the subject, right? Okay. If you don't have that interest in the subject, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I paying for it? Because if it's presented to you as a consumer good, then you have to ask the question, if I'm paying all this money, am I getting the value out of it that I want? And I think for many people, they don't get that.
So then, Professor, do you feel that attending a university can be considered to be instrumental in any way towards, getting a job? One thing that you mentioned earlier is that, if it comes to, say, a university like this right here, where the cost is like significantly lower as compared to those private universities out there, like Lord Voldemort, he who shall not be named, so to speak, then you seem to have converged upon the idea that those are not really worth it to attend. I feel that, considering, right, like education can take place in many different forms. Certainly universities are not skills training centers, but there could be multiple pathways nonetheless that include maybe a university. But what do you think, Professor?
Absolutely.
You would say?
100%. And increasingly, it's not just absolutely, but increasingly, that will be the way forward.
That meaning?
Multiple pathways.
Right.
Getting your education through different, at different places, through different processes, through different types of certification, even across many different subjects. You might start a degree in history and then decide that you want to go into content development.
Okay.
There are a huge number of historians who are extremely wealthy because they went into content development and produce history shows that you see on TV. David Starkey from Cambridge, a multi-millionaire because of his history shows and his books. Right? And so you wouldn't necessarily think, I'll be a historian and then I will become a millionaire, but it is possible. But that requires multi-skill. You're not necessarily going to learn about content development on your history degree program. So you would need to have different pathways to get to that level. There's also the question of, do I really need to spend 3 years on this single subject? Well, can I get what I need after a year?
Possibly.
And then move on to something else?
Possibly. Now, do you feel, Professor, that the university, at the very least in modern contexts, can play an instrumental role, I guess, in helping to develop these multifaceted skill sets right here? Or do you feel that at the end of the day, like when it comes to the question of the bargain, essentially, of time and money, that encapsulates, a student's education, that on balance, it may be more worthwhile to pursue, skills in an external environment?
The only real thing that a professor at a university can teach you to do by way of career development is how to be a professor at a university. Or how to be a researcher. Because that's what we do. Most professors at university have never had a job outside of a university. And that's not a bad thing. because their vocation, what they want to achieve in life has been to be in a university. That's it. Right? That's what they wanted to do. But increasingly, the professors are being asked to help people to build their career outside of the university. We're constantly being told, oh, make it industry relevant. They don't know what the industry wants. They have no conception of it.
I see.
Even if they have worked in industry or outside of the university for some time, in many instances, it was decades ago. And so what they knew then is really not up to date.
Okay.
Sometimes we are being asked to train people for specific industry relevant technologies. We simply don't have these technologies inside the university.
I see.
Yeah, because the universities don't have the resources. So it's not possible for us to do this.
I see. Okay.
So what we can do and what we do very well is to train people to think and to train people to have the capacity to question and to encourage and nurture their curiosity.
I see.
And if they're curious about a particular topic, to help them to find out and do the research so that they can build on that curiosity. And that's where they will get the value from it. But we can't necessarily teach people how to make content like this. Right? we could, yes, we could, but we would have to reskill, right? So that's not necessarily what you come to a university for. Part of the problem is, first, we have this conception that the universities are an elite. That's just not true. Right? University and university professors are good at some things. Normally a very specific thing. Yeah. Some of them are very, very good at that thing. Most of them are not. Most of them are just ordinarily good at teaching maths, or ordinarily good at coding, or ordinarily good at economics, or ordinarily good at history. They're not an elite. They're just relatively good at it. This is what they want to do in their life, and they've made that choice. It's their vocation, right? So they will be good, but not an elite. So we have this question about, this is an elite institution, you have to go there. The second is, there isn't much of an alternative. If you want to have a certificate to show to an employer, a potential employer, that you have a set of skills, or you have a set of capabilities, set of talents, you need to be able to certify that. And the only way that we have is through the universities. But now we are developing, like I mentioned before, things like Microsoft certificates and this sort of thing, where these are actually more valuable in the IT industry than a university degree. And to the extent that some universities, particularly the private universities, are offering the Microsoft certificates as part of their course. So when you have this, in economics we call it a signal. The certificate is a signal. It helps you to show to whoever you want, but normally an employer, to show them that, yes, you do have this level of capability. Up to now, and in the past, you could only really get that from a university. But emerging now and into the future, you will be able to get that from other credible sources. And then that will diminish the usefulness of a university. And then you won't have to go to the university. And everybody will be happier. Everyone will be happy.
Excellent. Okay.
Because the academics will have fewer students, we will be happy. We will have fewer students who are not really interested, they just want the certificate, just go get the certificate somewhere else. They're not really interested in the subject, right? Or don't go study something else, right?
I see. Okay.
We will be happier. The students will be happier because they won't spend so much time and pay so much money. And the employers will be happier because they will look at a certificate and say, I know that this is worth something. But here's the name of a private university. I have no knowledge of it. I don't know what this is worth.
I see. Okay.
I know a Microsoft certificate is worth something. I know the university of somewhere certificate isn't worth much because I don't know where it is.
Okay.
So
Fair.
for the employer, it's more valuable. So the employer is happier, the student is happier, the academics are happier, PTPTN is happier because they're not issuing loans that are not going to be repaid. The government will be happier because they're not having to bail out.
True. Yes.
And your parents will be happier because they won't have to pay for all of this. You see, so everyone will be happier if we have this change in mindset and this, these, as you say, different pathways to get the certification that we need. We used to have it in a way in the past. We used to have professional certificates which were meaningful. We used to have apprenticeships which were meaningful. You would get skills for working on the job, and that meant something. And that drifted away to now everyone has to go into the university. And actually, we should be going back to that. We should be raising the polytechnics and raising the TVET, shorter courses, focus more on skills, done in a very different way, and then leave the universities to get on with what we are actually very good at, which is teaching and learning, research and thought leadership, and collegiality and community engagement. That's what we're good at. But we're not good at training people for the labor market.
I see. And in fact, you were with YB Shin Tong Liu yesterday, the Deputy Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry. We had just met earlier, as I told you. And you had spoken at the symposium, Labour Market Reforms in Malaysia, Challenges and Opportunities. So then, now you've contextualized quite a fair bit with yourself. You're thinking about higher education and also about CVET and various other things of that nature. Would you perhaps give us a state of the nation, if you will? What you see really as the current, maybe problems, the good things, if there are some good things right there, and I guess, well, the considerations that people should bear in mind when thinking about the current Malaysian labour market.
We have to understand, and this is what I was discussing yesterday, and YB he's really smart actually. Because he said something yesterday, which I thought, well, that's really cool and really smart.
Wow.
Because he said,
yeah,
the government is not the HR department for the private sector.
Okay.
And private sector companies have to take responsibility for their own HR development, their own human capital development, all of that.
Right.
The government can help and assist and do what the government wants, but the government cannot take on that responsibility. And this is absolutely right. This is sort of music to my ears, because what I was basically making the case for is less government interference in the labour market, freeing up the labour market, allowing people to make choices for themselves. Why? Because we can see already that they are making choices for themselves, and they make those choices because it's better. So one of the main things that I was trying to emphasize is if we look in terms of observation of the labour market, we have about 24 million people of working age, roughly. About 17 million of those are in the labour force. That means 7 million people are outside of the labour force. If you're talking to a World Bank economist, they will say, oh, this is absolutely terrible. Let's get them out, to put them in, to get these women into the labour force. That's all they will say, right? But they have made a choice to do that. They have made an active choice. The two main groups of people who are outside the labour force are people who are in education and training, and people who are making a really valuable economic contribution by running their home. Staying at home and running the home. It's a really, really, really high value economic and social and personal contribution. And the reason that they do that is they have made a positive choice to do that. What is the basis of the positive choice that they're making? Because if you look at the labour market, objectively, what you see in the labour market is very poor. In the labour market as a whole, you see about 6.6 million people in formal private sector contracts. And half of those people earn less than 2,900 ringgit a month. And that's gone up, actually, just in the last quarter. Because in the previous quarter, it was as low as 2,600 ringgit. So it's gone up 300 ringgit in just 3 months. So looking at that, 2,900, half of people are earning less than that. And actually, that's about 50% earning less than that. But actually, about 40% will be earning below 2,500 and there's 2 million earning the minimum wage. So when people look at that, that objectively is a very bad salary, right? It makes complete sense that they would choose not to do that.
If you think about the etymology of economics, I mean, like, it comes back to the Greek words oikos, like the word for family, and nomos, like, which is basically management in various ways right there. So in a sense, maybe, well, that is indeed a very high value activity, which is
But it's not monetized.
yeah.
It's not monetized. So what happens is, you could call it a misconception, but actually I would go further. It's a lie, an economic lie. The
Yeah.
profession as a whole is lying.
Pardon, the profession.
The
don't
economic
think the-
profession as a whole
yes.
is lying if it says that taking time outside of the labor force is a bad thing. It's not true. And the reason I say that it's a lie is because we know that it's not true. But we still allow this idea to be perpetuating, which is to say, if you are not in the labor force working, you are not adding value, or you are not doing something which is valuable. And that's not true. And all economists know that it's not true. You can be outside of the labor force doing something which is immeasurably valuable. But we don't put a dollar and cent or a ringgit and cent
All right.
value on it. That's why we say it has no value, because it does have value, but we didn't put a dollar value on it. If you were to put a dollar value on it, you would find that the activity that's carried out in the home, which is mostly done by women, and you actually gave that a proper economic, financial, monetary value, it would be every bit as much value as people working in the formal labor market. Every bit as much.
Then I would like to quote the late Deng Xiaoping, otherwise known as the father of development of China in some ways, after Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward. He said, "To get rich is glorious. Every single transaction that you make right there becomes part of another person's income. And eventually then there are multipliers that eventually result in the circulation of things throughout our economy. Resources move, things essentially go from hand to hand."
You
and
could
so
be an
this-
economics lecturer. You should start already.
I've received an endorsement.
You get 100% endorsement.
Oh, thank you. So one person's spending is another person's income in various ways. And I am not completely to be credited for that. I would credit Ray Dalio for that.
John Maynard Keynes.
John Maynard Keynes, yeah. John Maynard Keynes. Yeah.
Circular flow of income. It's the same.
Yeah, circular flow of income, John Maynard Keynes. When we think about, well, the resources, right, that we consume right now. I mean, I was just at the World Bank panel just the other day, and one of the panelists, Dato Sri Idris Jala, was commenting that, well, look at everything that's in this room right now. He was like looking at the television screen that was in front of him. He was looking at the couch, looking at like various other things.
He's looking at himself on the TV screen. Probably.
Maybe.
I was doing that yesterday.
Wow.
People think they're looking at the screen. They're actually looking at turning your head like this to get your best side.
If we think about, let's say, things like the cost of living and essentially, well, obtaining, right, what is necessary, right, to obtain daily sustenance right there. So then there's no question about it, right? Like there needs to be some sort of ownership or ability to continue retrieving resources, which of course is correlated to, well, the money that you do receive, which in turn is necessarily and intricately tied to a country's, well, foreign transactions and also to the value of its currency, which is operationalized by, well, the demand for its currency in the open market as well as its monetary policy along the way right there. While it's true that you can essentially underestimate the value of economic activities, not dollarized, but essentially conducted at home, what are your thoughts about, well, the working population of Malaysia within the economy that we are in at this moment?
I think that we need to have a fresh perspective, a different perspective,
Right.
which goes against the conventional wisdom. that you mentioned about the World Bank and all of this, that conventional wisdom, that conventional understanding in the context of Malaysia, in my view, is wholly incorrect. And we need really to reflect again on the data, because DOSIM, the Department of Statistics Malaysia, produce wonderful data. If you look at this data, it tells you a story. You don't need to make up the story that we hear from the World Bank or other people like that. You don't need to make up a story. Look at the data. Data tells you what the story is. And what the story is something like this. Of the 17 million people in the labor force, you have a tiny, tiny, tiny number who are unemployed. Less than 600,000, 500 to 600,000, tiny. You ask the question, why are they unemployed? Why do you have just such a small number of people who are unemployed? The answer is they cannot live if they don't work, right? Because the level of social protection and unemployment protection is very, very sparse, very thin. And that means they have to work. They have to work at any salary, at any job, at any time. And like you mentioned before, you have to be actively seeking work. So they are actively seeking work, right? So if they're actively seeking work and they've worked for just 1 hour in the previous week, they're not considered to be unemployed. So you have that very low level of unemployment, but you have a massive amount of underemployment. Underemployment by skills, as I mentioned before, particularly graduates, but also a smaller proportion, but it's an important proportion of underemployment by time. And that means that people are not doing a full-time job. They're going in when they're needed, and they're going home when they're needed. It could be flexible working, that'd be great, right? But most of the time, it's not flexible working. They're doing a fewer hours because there isn't the work to support them. So you have that, and that is very big. That's about 2 million out of the total labor force. So you have this unemployment and this underemployment. Then you have 6.6 million people who are in formal private sector contracts. Then you have about 1.3, 1.4 million people who are in the government sector. Roughly add them together is about 8 million. Out of the 17 million, following the maths right, all the 17 million. The people who are left over are either people who are employers, that means they're working, but they're not employees. Or they are working for their family, so they're working, but they're not as employees. These are tiny, both of those are relatively small numbers. But then you have this big number of people who are called own account workers. And own account workers are what we otherwise call gig economy workers. Freelancers who are sometimes people who are running their own micro enterprise, right? And this number of people in that category is approaching the same number of people in formal private sector employment, 6.6 million. It's not quite there yet, but it's almost the same. And people are taking on these own account worker jobs, these gig economy jobs, micro enterprise sources of income, not out because they're forced to do it, but because they choose to do it. Why do they choose to do it? It's better. In economics, we call this a revealed preference. We can see from the choice that they are making that they are choosing this type of activity. And you would only choose that type of activity if it were better, right? Why is it better? They have greater flexibility in terms of hours worked. They have greater flexibility in terms of their work-life balance if they want to work and study. They have greater flexibility in terms of what they do, who they work for, when they're working. They are basically managing themselves and not in some oppressive employment relation. Boss knows best, turn up at 9, leave at 5, if you're 5 minutes late, I'm going to scold you. None of that, right? They have complete freedom, right, to do what they wish because they're running their own Sure.
yeah.
Right?
Like if it were a China company, basically, as it is said, then basically you would come at 9. Wow, why you so late, ah?
And even if you had an excuse as, I got stuck in a traffic jam.
Walao eh.
Yes, exactly.
Cannot leh.
Exactly. And then
Why you want to leave at 5? Why you want to leave at 5? My contract says so. Walao eh. I employ you because I want you to come and be a good worker, and then you give me this nonsense. You stay until 5. You stay until like 10 o'clock. You gotta.
you know, that's why you don't choose that. Right?
All right.
You don't choose that. And increasingly, particularly, Gen Z are not choosing this, right? Gen Y are not choosing this.
Interesting.
And then increasingly, even people like of my age, I don't know which one I am, but even we are saying, forget it.
Interesting.
I'm not interested in it, right? That people are saying, I don't want to sit in a traffic jam for 2 hours in the morning to get into work for 9 o'clock, then someone scolds me because I got there at 9:05. And I don't want to spend another 2 hours in the evening driving back. I leave at 5, I don't get home until 7. I don't want to do that. When I can do it online, I can do it much more flexibly, work from home, all of this.
See, okay.
So this is what is happening in the labor market. And the point to be made is people are actively choosing this because it's better. And the market is solving the problems. If you have formal private sector contracts, low salaries, long hours, difficult bosses, right? Difficult terms and conditions of employment, restricting what you're doing, restricted holidays, all of this. If that's the way that the formal private sector contracts are, people will say, you know what? I can make more money not doing that.
Interesting.
And they're choosing it in their millions. And this is a very significant shift, and it will only increase. It will continue to increase. The more that people have options to earn money online, earn money in different ways, find different ways of making money, they will increasingly move away from formal contracts into the informal economy.
Fascinating.
Now, the point that I was making yesterday is this is a good thing. And this is the difference between the conventional wisdom that says, this is a terrible thing, or so many people are informal employed, they have to go be formally employed. That's the conventional wisdom. Formal employment is better, right? No, that's not correct. If it was good, people would choose it. The better view is to say people are choosing informal employment, and there is nothing wrong with it. So, why do you want to interfere with your gig economy commission? Why do you want to force these people to have this type of insurance, or pay their EPF, or pay their SOL, or this? Why you want to? This is going well. These guys have a job. They're earning an income. Why do you want to interfere with them?
All right.
The answer to that is this. Before the government made an allocation, nobody was interested in the gig economy. No politician was interested in the gig economy. So then you have to ask the question, what is it that politicians find so attractive about an 800 million budget for the gig economy? Is it because they care about the gig economy? Or is it because they care about the 800 million budget? Because before, they didn't care. And what we need to be very cautious about is that we don't kill the gig economy. Because the gig economy is not just motorbike drivers or e-hailers or these guys, taxi drivers. The gig economy is doctors working in private hospitals who will move from one hospital to another hospital wherever the patient is. They don't work at a single hospital. In fact, they don't work at a hospital at all. They work as independent medical specialists. Lawyers are gig economy people. They only work when they have a client. They're no client, no work. Academics increasingly are becoming gig economy workers. Right? But much more important than that, a whole range of types of activities which are very high paid, very high skill, which formal employment doesn't help, that doesn't provide. Content developers, right? Influencers, online influencers, coders, app developers, all of this type of thing you wouldn't have a company that says, we employ people specifically to influence. Right? We employ people specifically for content development. We employ people specifically for app design. The app designers work for themselves. The content developers work for themselves. The influencers work for themselves, and they make huge amount of money doing it.
Now, I'd like to shift on a little bit right here. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was that universities are not elite institutions in a sense right there. I'd like to kind of like touch upon right here. About a month ago, the New York Times published an article titled, "What Do Students at Elite Colleges Really Want?" One of the things that it actually converged upon right there, and I will read now the subtitle, it says, "Many of Harvard's Generation Z say sellout is not an insult." The opening paragraph of the article reads, "The meme was of an image of a head with 'I need to get rich' slapped across it. Freshmen, after spending 0.02 seconds on campus, read the caption posted in 2023 to the anonymous messaging app. This whole educational experience right here, you do see essentially that, well, some people actually might choose a little differently from simply, well, going out there and then involving themselves in the gig economy. This article right here in the New York Times, which I might send you a little later, it is essentially saying that, well, an increasing number of students at selective universities tend to be making the choice, essentially to try to go after, well, employment, essentially, in, well, certain prestigious firms right here. And there's been this culture of normalization, really, of essentially employment within these kinds of selective contexts right there. I was actually speaking to a fellow alumnus of yours from Cambridge who had told me about how, well, certain firms, like for example McKinsey, had recruited upon campus, and he had essentially heard a story about how this recruiter had apparently written a book called "When McKinsey Came to Town," about the story of the insecure high achiever. When we think about, well, the students in these kinds of elite colleges and the sorts of choices that they seem to be making, which seem somewhat at odds with the idea of participating in the gig economy right there. So then, like, what does that tell us? Is it an instance of what we call false consciousness, or what do you think?
Well, the people who are doing that obviously have in their head some idea of what they want to achieve, right? They want to get a high-paid job. They want to work for some I'm not going to say high-powered, at some sort of high-profile consultancy company. That's what they want to achieve.
Williams Business Consultancy.
Well, perhaps in the future, but I hope not. I hope not. But then there are many of us. I mean, I was headhunted at Cambridge. I turned it down. I was headhunted by the Treasury. I was headhunted by the bank. And I turned it down. I turned down a job at the IMF twice. You know, I was headhunted by multiple places. And the reason I did that was because I didn't want, that's not the choice I wanted. You know, they asked me to go to Washington to the IMF, and I said, no, I'm going to go to Oxford and do the work in Oxford. Now, that's what the type of thing that is offered when you work at the so-called elite universities. But that's the signal. But the other thing that is offered is the network. So when I was at London Business School, they were very open about it. And they would say, it's not really the content of our courses, nor is it actually our faculty. Our faculty are wonderful in many ways, world-class in many ways, but you could go somewhere else and you can still get world-class faculty, right? What you come here for is the network. And then the network will help you to deliver the entree to the consulting company or the bank or whatever it is, or the law firms or this sort of thing. If you want that and you want that network, then yes, going to these so-called elite universities, of course, will help you, because many people from Cambridge go into these high-level things, right? What universities are good at doing is training you to work for someone else. And these elite universities are also very good at training you to work for someone else. But what they're not good at doing is training you to be an entrepreneur.
I see.
So if you look at the GOSIM statistics for graduates, 90% of graduates who are employed are working for somebody else, and only 9% are either running their own company or are micro entrepreneurs running their own business for themselves. So only a tiny proportion of people who go to university will come out with this entrepreneurial attitude. But 90% of them will be working for someone, right? So if you want to make a great deal of money, you're not going to do that working for somebody else. If you want to make a great deal of money and have all of this control over your own life, you're better shot at doing it as an entrepreneur. And universities need to deliver entrepreneurs.
Now, kind of, well, moving beyond the concern of, well, the elite university then. So then we are now faced with a materially new era in a range of different ways, particularly with the advent of what is called generative AI. Now, I read a book from Oxford University a while ago about how, in fact, when we think about the nature of what we call jobs, essentially, a job might be thought of as essentially a collection of tasks that eventually repeat over the course of time, certain things that you need to do in order to, well, essentially receive your paycheck right there. If you were essentially a farmer, for example, in an olden era, you would be tilling the land, for example. But nowadays, then the job scope essentially entails different tasks. You might be driving a truck, for example, and essentially coordinating a range of different machines or people who do the same thing. But the same job title applies right there. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this idea of what we call productivity right there. In a world where, well, tasks essentially can be automated, and that we would essentially be erring by going on the wrong side of history by simply saying that they could not be automated away. When you consider, well, the labor market and the intertwining or parallel development of artificial intelligence and generative technologies right there, do you imagine that there can be a plane of coexistence, or do you feel that the vine will eventually strangle the productivity and render humanity obsolete?
What, like the Terminator, that Skynet thing? I don't know. Perhaps we're going to go down that dystopian, dysfunctional route. I don't know. Perhaps we're already in it. Who knows? Perhaps it's all a matrix. Who knows? I think we have to view AI rationally, actually, and not get over concerned about it. When people were said to me, oh, you know, with this chat GPT, our students can get the AI to write their own essay. I said two things. The first is, why? Why would they want to do that? You know, do they have such a lack of self-respect and such a lack of self-confidence in their own capabilities that they feel that they wouldn't be able to answer even a very simple question? And I said, well, if that's the way that students are thinking, they should not be here. Or if that's the way that students are thinking, what are we doing as academics that we don't instill in somebody the sense of personal ethics, the ethics, the morality, the self-respect of saying to somebody, you can do this for yourself. You don't need to have some machine do it for you. We, as academics, should be helping them to understand, give them the self-confidence to do that. So if our students are cheating, then we have done something wrong, because we are not delivering the ethical basis on which our educational system is founded. But the second thing I noted, this is a bit of a joke, but the second thing I noted was, I will know for sure if the student is cheated. And they said, how are you? No, Prof, it's very realistic. It's so wonderfully well written. And I said, that's why I will know.
I see.
That's why I will know, because it will be perfectly written, perfectly well written. Even the stuff that I write is not perfectly well written. Right?
Yes.
And if this has no errors in it,
Mhm.
I know they didn't write it.
I see.
I know they didn't write it, just as I know that if I take this document and put it through Microsoft Word comparison, and it's exactly, they'll just look at it and
Right.
read it, I know they've cheated.
I see. Okay.
So as an academic of more than 30 years experience, I can look at a piece of student work and look at the student and say, I know you didn't do this.
Mhm.
Why is that? Because this is imperfect English and you can't speak English. Right?
Yes.
So this is why I said to my colleagues, we need to be rational about this and understand that it's coming. Well, it's here. Well, it's not coming, is it? It's here. What I mean is it's coming increasingly quicker. Every single day we're seeing new stuff. And recognize we can use this. We can use this well and properly, but we need to look at the ethics of the use of it, as well as the practicalities of the use of it. And that's really what we need to understand. What does it mean? People used to say this actually about Google search. I remember for sure, because when I was doing my PhD, we were just at the beginnings of this internet search. We had different search engines. It wasn't, everything now is Google, and everybody would just use Google, nothing else. But then we had Jeeves and all of this sort of, right? And each one was different, because each one had a different search database. And so we would go to this. And I remember at that time that my supervisor said to me, you shouldn't be doing this. You should go to the library and read through the library. I said, why? He said, because when you open the book, the journal, for the article that you want to read, you will have read through the index and you will see there were other articles there. And this is real scholarship. And then you will pick it and you will just read it out of interest. I went to read this, but then I decided to read that. You go there, sit back, relax. Don't rush it. Reflect on it. This is how you become a more reflective. Now, I would say to students, that say to anybody, if you're doing your literature review, for example, use this technology. But don't expect that anybody's going to be impressed if they read it and they can see immediately that this has been written by an algorithm. Because when you're doing, for example, a literature review, you don't just want a list of the papers. You want to know that the person has read it and is telling you why this is important, why it's not, how it connects, how it doesn't, what it's adding, what it isn't, where does it fit in the history of the thought process in the topic, all of this. It's layer upon layer of understanding what is the literature review. It's not just a list of papers. So in other words, we need to be able to learn how to do it, and it should be able to improve our, I'm talking about academics now, it should be able to improve our productivity as academics. But then if you look outside of the academic world, and you start to look not just at generative AI and ChatGPT and all of this, but you start to look at the automation processes and the digitalization processes, it will be exactly the professions that are being taught in the universities now that will be replaced. You will not need accountants. Why? Because as we move to e-commerce and online payment, e-banking, every transaction that you have will be registered with your bank or with your e-commerce site. This will automatically produce your accounts. You don't need an accountant. You don't need a bookkeeper. You don't need an accountant. You don't need an auditor, because every single transaction will be registered through the blockchain. And then, which job will be replaced? Accountancy. How many, well, here we are in a public university, but in Malaysia as a whole, how many people at the moment now actively are studying to be accountants? Tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands, not just a few, tens of thousands. And within a matter of years, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there will be absolutely no need for that job. Okay. But even when we think about medical practitioners, Many of particularly the most acute and detailed type of medical procedures are better done by machines than can be done by people. Now, this is not going to replace medical practitioners quickly or at all. It will probably just be used to help them to do things better. But what you can't change and what you cannot automate and replace with a robot, you can replace the doctor. You can't replace the nurse because the nurse is there for interhuman care and support. And a machine can't do that. So it is exactly the type of technology resistant jobs that will be in demand in the future. Whereas we are not training enough. We're not training. People are complaining about the doctor's brain drain. But this is because everybody wants their son or their daughter to be a doctor, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it's actually the nurses that we are, and not just normal nurses for general medical and general surgical specialisms, but care assistants for the elderly, care assistants for the young, care assistants for people with disabilities. And in the future, we will need literally millions of these people. Because there's about 3.6 million people above 60, right? And that number is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. If you imagine that each one of those people will at some point need a care assistant or a geriatric nurse, or will go into hospital because as you get older, you go to hospital more often. And there are 3.6 million now. And that number is going to double by 2040. You will need to double at least the number of nurses that we have now. Right? And doubling the number of nurses that we have now involves the training of hundreds of thousands of nurses. No more doctors, nurses. And you cannot replace that with an autobus. Right? You can't replace it with the fourth industrial revolution thing. In other words, what I'm saying is we need to move away from this idea that high value activity is to do with this particular type of profession, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, and begin to understand that it will be technology resistant activity that will be in the most demand. And these are exactly the things that we are not training for or not providing at university. And exactly the things that we are training for, lawyers, accountants, doctors, these are exactly the type of things that will be replaced.
You mentioned earlier the idea of being reflective. And so, Professor, I would then ask you, if you were to go back in time to a time when Professor Williams was nearly at that point, Geoffrey Williams, looking at that university admissions letter, but suddenly now captivated with that burst of inspiration from knowledge a la Charles Dickens' Ghosts of Christmas Past, imparting knowledge unto your younger self right there. If you could go back and do it all over again, I mean, what would you do differently? Would you have done the university degree again?
Well, it's always, yeah, I would like to go back and do it again if I knew now. If I knew then what I know now, definitely I would go back and I would do it again. But if I were to go back without knowing now, or if I were to give advice to somebody, if I were back where I was in Liverpool, in a council house in Liverpool, having applied to go to Cambridge University, which I did, would I have done that again from a comprehensive school? You know, everybody telling me you'll never get in, you have no chance. Yes, I would do it again. But 100% hands down, I would do it again. And the reason for that was, it's the best university in the world, and it's my birthright. I have a right to go there. Right? I don't have anybody tell me you can't go there because it's an elite, and you are not from an elite. You know, my family is very working class, very poor, right? My father's a bus driver, right? So people were saying to me, you're not the type of person who goes to that elite university. And actually, that's not true. Because when I went to college, at Burton College, I found it was exactly the type people where I came from. It was exactly an environment which was open and which was accessible. And people were telling me that this is an elite and you can't go there. Everybody can go, but you have to apply. Right? So I definitely would apply. And the first reason that, as I said, I would do that, it is my birthright. It's your birthright as a Malaysian to come to University Malaya. Yeah, your birthright. Right? No one can tell you not to do this. The second reason is that I was genuinely curious about economics, to the extent that I wanted to find out what on earth is this all about? Why are people unemployed, right? What is this inflation that we're having to deal with? Why is it that the government is telling us we can't spend on this and we have to tax on that? I have genuine curiosity about what all that was about. And it was part of a political debate, of course, because we have something called political economy. Most economists have an interest in the politics of it, but it wasn't really driven by the politics of it, because politicians are really quite dumb, actually. So it's not really that. It's very, very boring.
That is a credit to Chin Tong.
Yes, not him. No, not him. He's not at all. He's not at all. He's very smart. But it's not just that. It's like the politicians are debating this and this and this and this. The economists come and say, you know what? We already know the answer to this question, right?
I see.
We already know the answer to this question. Your problem is you're just not prepared to agree to it, because
it's like you let a horse to water, and then the horse basically looks at you and they all like, this is not water. Right there.
And you just say, I can solve your problem. There it is. So there is that. There was the genuine curiosity of it. And the third thing was why I chose Cambridge was that they offered that possibility that you could nurture your curiosity and be allowed to do it. Right? We always say that there were 3 courses, right? There is the course that is run by the university in the lectures that we go to or don't. I didn't go to very many, but there are lectures that because it's not compulsory, right? So there's the lecture course. Then there's the course from the college, which we call them supervisions, they're tutorials. That is compulsory, right? I was fined for not attending tutorials. So there's that. There's the second course. And these are guided by the academics, both of them, right? The university academics and the college academics. And then the third is the course that you devise for yourself. This sort of autodidactic. You follow your own curiosity. And Cambridge allowed that and encouraged it. And actually, if you want to get a first at Cambridge, you have to have that level of curiosity. You have to be able to show the examiner something that the examiner didn't teach you. And when I was in Oxford for 3 years teaching, that's exactly what distinguished between someone who got a very good upper second and somebody who got a first. I can look at it and I can say, this guy is showing me something that was not on the curriculum. That this person is original somehow. Could be anything, just the way that they've expressed themselves, or the observation that they've made, a bit of data, reference to a book that I hadn't read. So when I was marking the undergraduate exam papers, 400 undergraduate exam papers, I had to. The way that you were able to identify a first class paper was they said something new, something different, something that you hadn't expected. And that's because you are encouraged and nurtured and expected to have this self-driven, autodidactic, almost vocation. And if you don't have that, you shouldn't be there. That's the attitude. But it's like, go somewhere else if you don't have that, because that's what not, it's like, because you're not getting as much value out of the place if you go. Yeah, it'd be better for you to go somewhere else.
Right there.
So I definitely would have chosen to go to Cambridge. I think I left Cambridge and went to Liverpool University to do my master's degree because that was a deliberate choice, because at Liverpool University, it was exactly the opposite economic philosophy. At Liverpool University, they were monetarists. Cambridge University, they were
Hashtag Chicago represent.
yes, Chicago, British monetarists, and then at Cambridge, of course, there were Keynesians. And I wanted to find from the genuine article, Patrick Minford, what does a monetarist think and how? And I learned more from him than every single one of my Cambridge lecturers, for sure. And then after that, I moved to the UEA in Norwich because they gave me a scholarship to continue to finish my PhD. I wouldn't have been able to do it without the scholarship. And for me, going to the UEA was a completely different experience because it's a new university, relatively new university from the 1960s. But what was so interesting about the place was it had this genuine open and liberal attitude to thinking and learning and expressing yourself and debating politely or impolitely sometimes. And just the vocation of doing it because it's interesting and your interest justifies it in itself intellectually. And it turns out, of course, all of my supervisors and lecturers were from Oxford and Cambridge as well, or from overseas, where they were also, I mean, my supervisor was from India, so from Bihar. And so I learned such a huge amount from that. So if you were to ask me, would I do that differently? No, I wouldn't do that differently. And I mean, of course, one or two things I did I shouldn't have done, and one or two things I should have done I didn't do. But you know, the generality of it. Do I regret turning down a job at the IMF twice?
No.
No. Do I regret turning down a job at the Bank of England? Do I regret turning down a job at the Her Majesty's Treasury, if it was then? No. Not really, because I don't think that would have given me a different experience well, it obviously would have, because it's a much more bureaucratic snitching civil service, right? But institutional, it would give me a much more institutional approach. And what I find talking to people who have this background is that they are much more concerned about what is the institutional view? What is the conventional wisdom? This is the line, and I'm going to toe it. Whereas what they taught at Cambridge was, you find out what the conventional wisdom is, and you challenge it. That's your job. Challenge it. In fact, that's how I got in the first place. I remember my question in my interview by my supervisor, Professor Frank Wilkinson. That was the question he asked every one of us. He asked, what is the conventional wisdom? We had to define it. What should we do in respect of the conventional wisdom?
That sounds
confront it.
John Kenneth Galbraith, I think.
That's exactly where it came from. Because we were all asked to read The Affluent Society before we went to the interview. Galbraith told us what the conventional wisdom is from an economics perspective, right? In terms of how you define it. But then the question is, so what is it now? And at that time it was Thatcherism. It was Thatcherism, free markets, 1989, just toward the end of the Thatcher period. But then the question, the question was to challenge it. And I said, I don't think it should be challenged, in the sense that the alternative, which is the Keynesian view, is demonstrably wrong. And this, of course, you need to challenge it in one way or another. But he wanted me, as an interviewer, wanted me to basically tear apart the Thatcherite, the monetarist, the market-based approach. And I said to him, it has its limitations, and here are the limitations. But actually, the people who have the alternative view have even more limitations. And he was sort of astonished by that. And I thought, all right, forget it. I've given up. I might as well not come back. I already failed. And I went home and I said I failed because I told him everything he stands for was such a rubbish. And then later, I got a letter from the college. And you know when you get the reply letter and you don't know and you're quite nervous. And of course I was quite nervous. I was sitting there on the telephone table. And I looked at it. I didn't want to pick it up. And then I thought to myself, that letter is fat. Because I heard the college name of the doctor. And I said, if it's a rejection letter, it wouldn't be fat. And so when I opened it up, it was, of course, and it went on forever. It was sort of, thank you very much for coming. We very much appreciate it. Oh, Dr. Wilkinson was very happy to discuss all the, and he went, discuss this. What are you talking about? What's the answer? And then it said, we look forward to seeing you in Michaelmas.
Wow.
It didn't even say, congratulations, you have been admitted. That was what it said. It said, we look forward to seeing you in Michaelmas. And then I thought, well, that means you're in. And then I picked up the other document. Well, why is it fat? It was all applying for rooms, giving all of your next of kin data, all to fill out the form, when are you going to turn up, all of this. So my advice is, if you apply for something like that and you get a thin letter, that's probably bad news. If you get a thick letter, you're probably in.
I see. Wow. All right. Then I have a final question for you, and thank you so much for your time so far. Well, you've spoken very extensively, Professor, about the role of the university as it should be in its ideal form, the limitations and the constraints of the university in the sense of academics, essentially being academics, not necessarily involved, so to speak, in the professional world. The US may be slightly different, but of course that is the US right there. But you've also spoken about how essentially, well, TVET should be something that should be emphasized upon for the development of skills. Yet we are here currently in a university, and you have been to some of the very best universities in the world. And you spoke about how a university should be a place to foster thinking, critical engagement, and learning, perhaps self-actualization, if we put it in the eloquent way that you had earlier. And so, in your view then, what do you think that the universities, maybe not just of Malaysia, but of the world generally, should do to become better catalysts to the self-actualization of the students that grace their halls?
I think we should be more honest to students and tell them what we will not be able to deliver for them, and to tell them what we can deliver for them. And then to say to the students, you really want to pay a lot of money for what we offer, right? We can offer self-actualization, as you mentioned. We can offer network. We can offer an opportunity to do nothing very much for 4 years with an excuse. Right? We can offer the opportunity to be in a hugely diverse community of people that you probably would not have met at school. And so if you didn't come to us, you probably wouldn't meet this huge diverse number of people. Different countries, different ages, different subjects. We can offer all of that. We can, you can join all of this societies and all of this, whatever you want to do, we can offer that too. Right? But that's basically what we can offer. It's a place where you can come for 3 or 4 years and prepare yourself for life, but not for the job market. And then we should say and be honest with students. You want to come to us and be an entrepreneur. 90% of our people do not do that. 90% of our graduates do not do that. They work for somebody else. You want to come and get a qualification that will give you a good salary. Starting salary is 1,600 ringgit. You want it or not? You want to pay 30,000 ringgit and then starting salary of 1,600 or not? It's up to you, right? You want to get a very good job with a career progression? No, it'll take you 4 or 5 years to do that. Afterwards, in other words, we can get you in. By all means, yeah. You want to be a lawyer, you need a certificate. You want to be an accountant, you need a degree. You want to be a doctor, you need a degree. We can get you in. But the rest of your career development's got nothing to do with us.
What about if, let's say, people choose to go to the Harvards of the world, the Cambridges of the world?
We can get you in to the network. Yeah.
Good.
You know, class of 2024. And also, some of the alumni go back, yeah, for sure. We can get you into that network. But you are the one who's going to have to go and find those guys, meet those guys, apply for those jobs, persuade them that it's you and not the other Harvard graduate sitting next to you that they take. Yeah?
Right.
So all of that will be out of our hands. Yeah? And if you actually put that prospect directly to people who are spending 4 years of their life and tens of thousands of ringgit and going into debt as a consequence, and put it honestly and straightforwardly and say, this is the prospect. Let them make a rational decision. The rational decision would be for most people not to do it. But for a small number of people, yeah, they wouldn't care because they are driven by a vocation. When I went to university, 20% of us went to university. Yeah. And barely 10% stayed in the university afterwards.
Of the 20%.
Yeah. And that's because we knew, even though it was free, we knew that it was really something you only did if you wanted to do it. Yeah. And we never really thought about getting a job afterwards. If you want to get a job, why would you go to Cambridge and read classics? Or, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic. Right? Why would you read these esoteric subjects, astrophysics, if you wanted to get a job? That was not the purpose of going to the university. And that's why very few of us went. That's why people say it's an elite. Yeah, it's not an elite. It's just a small number of people, because they're very elite suggests you're actually good at something, right? and there are people who are very much better, and they're not there, right? So it's not the elite. It isn't the elite. It's just a selected group of people. So if we put this prospect to people and the reality of what it is to people, those who genuinely want to come to university and genuinely will get value out of the university will still come.
Amazing.
But those who feel they're going to come to university and make a fortune or be the next Bill Gates or the next Zuckerberg, forget it. They're dropouts.
And with that in mind, thank you, Professor Williams, for the incredible conversation.
Okay, pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.